Greetings of the day to all the viewers joining from different parts of the world. Myself, Subhashish Modal. I am the podcast host for Airworthy Talks for Udan Aviation Academy. Today is the beginning of a new chapter. We are entering the second year of our Airworthy Talks. And this year, we are looking to bring in much more industry experts who will guide you across the unknown areas of the aviation industry. Today on our show, we have with us Arvind Chandrasekhar, Associate Partner for Lufthansa Consulting. And from Arvind's profile, I could definitely see that there is no continent on planet Earth which Arvind has not put his charm of management consultancy upon. Certainly, he has worked with various airlines, various airports, and advised them on not only strategic level but also operational level. And we are looking forward to have an excellent session going forward with Arvind. So Arvind, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thanks, Subhashish. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Right. Arvind, I'll jump straight on to question. Management consultancy, it's something which our learners and our listeners are not very known to. And when they think about this profile, they always seem to sort of scratch their head as to what do the person does. So I just want to know basically what is the day in the life of an Arvind like, or what is the day in the life of a management consultant?
Yeah, there's a running joke in the industry that it's difficult to explain it, right? To explain to your parents or grandparents what exactly you do. But the life, and there's no average day in the life of a management consultant, which is one of the things that makes consulting an interesting career choice. But it can be quite busy, and it varies quite a bit depending on what you're working on, right? Whether you're working on a project versus sales activities, research, or a mix of all of these, whether you are on site embedded with the client versus working remotely from your office or your home, as we are now, whether you're working on something that's highly analytical and data driven versus something which is a bit more process or people oriented. So, how a typical day or even a typical week looks can vary quite a bit depending on the specifics of what you're working on. It also depends realistically on how senior you are in the company, right? Because the responsibilities will vary.
Right.
But let's take the perspective of, I'd say you typically have three types of things that you'd be doing, right? I call them ideating, which is more about thinking, structuring, putting together what it is that you want to do or coming up with ideas. Then there's the executing, which is the analysis, the research, right? Bringing together the different perspectives to come up with an answer for your client. And then there's the communicating or collaborating. And that could be with your team internally or with a client or with some entirely external stakeholder as well. And usually there's a mix of all three of these that you're doing in the course of a typical week. Of these, most of the time would typically be spent in ideating and executing. But again, it's a function of what kind of project you're doing. If you're doing something which is, for example, helping a company restructure their organization, then there's a huge amount of time that you invest in customer workshops and spending time with the CXOs and so on. Less time maybe on the pure execution aspect of it. Or rather, the communication is the execution in some cases. So it varies quite a bit in that way. What is usually the case though, if you're a consultant on a team, is that you will have a clear piece of work that you are responsible for. So, with your manager and other team members, you will know what you are expected to deliver, and then you can sort of work through the ideation, the execution, and the communication for your given work stream.
Right. Perfect. I mean, from what I could make out, it's quite a dynamic schedule which you have. And definitely every day is new, and obviously with that newness comes a lot of challenges, but then there comes a lot of learning as well along with it. And certainly people in this operations, particularly airline operations, they always come up with this quote, every day is a fresh day and every passenger is a new passenger. But I could definitely draw a parallel out here that the same is in case with your role as well, because every new day is a fresh perspective with the client, obviously with their challenges and solutions. So definitely, I mean, aviation is definitely a dynamic industry across various levels is what I could definitely see. Arvind, a
Understand.
lot is, yes, definitely. A lot is talked about Lufthansa Consulting, okay, as
Mm-hmm.
to what their impact is, not only on the European markets, but also on the transatlantic sector as well, as to what
Yeah.
all clients' portfolio they have. So, you being a partner out there, I wanted to know as to what is, Lufthansa Consulting all about? What are their prima facing, roles, and how do they sort of work with their various clients? So
Yeah.
some light on that. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I can't talk to specific clients, of course, but I can give you a broad sense.
Mhm, mhm,
So Lufthansa Consulting is an aviation specialist consulting firm, right? You can call it a boutique aviation
mhm,
consulting firm. It has a deep history because it's been in the industry for 40 years or so now. It's a member of the Lufthansa Group, as you can tell from the name.
right.
But it's like hundreds of other companies which are part of
Mhm,
this big mothership of the Lufthansa Group. But it operates at arm's length from the group itself. And what that means is that we are not a captive consulting firm. We do some work with the Lufthansa Group, not just the airlines, but with all of the other service companies as well. But it's often on a competitive basis with other consulting firms. So we are
right.
pitching for projects. And what that arm's length relationship allows us to do is also serve a number of clients elsewhere in the world,
Mhm,
not just in Europe, but pretty much across the world who have nothing to do with the Lufthansa Group.
right.
Um, in some sense, that's an advantage because if we need some very specific expertise in a particular function,
Mhm,
we could
mhm,
reach out to colleagues at Lufthansa to ask them for their support.
mhm,
But we can also still, in every other case, be completely independent with our Chinese walls with Lufthansa.
right.
And the interesting thing is, and you mentioned it earlier, right? The work is not just for airlines. It can be for airlines, airports, regulators, governments, investors,
Mhm,
service providers, pretty much anybody across the whole aviation ecosystem,
mhm,
depending
mhm,
on what is the kind of issue that they want to address.
right.
And the other angle to look at it is the nature of the work as well, because the folks that we have within the company have a huge amount of experience in aviation. Almost all of them have actually had proper line experience in an airline or airport. And what that
Right.
means is that we can advise our clients from something which is very broad strategy, organization,
Mhm,
you know,
mhm,
future fit, things of that sort, down
mhm,
to very technical things like what should be their approach to maintenance for the next couple
mhm,
of seasons, right? How do you set yourself up to pass an EOSA audit, things of that sort.
mhm,
So across the whole range of aviation functions, there are experts who can work with the clients. And for me, it's particularly great because I work typically on strategy, network, some commercial topics, but
mhm.
having these kind of colleagues around is a great learning experience for me as well. So I
Right.
continue to keep learning in the firm, which is great fun.
Definitely, definitely. And an organization is known for the employees they have. And certainly, from what I could make out, is this plethora of expertise which comes from people within the aviation industry itself makes the
Mhm.
entire sort of consulting firm blossom in a very big way. Also, the addition of your sister companies definitely help to sort of act as a catalyst across certain processes. So that's there. Now, talking about job roles,
Mhm.
management consultancy, particularly into such a niche domain like aviation industry, comes with its
Yeah.
own sort of risk and rewards. Okay. Um, when you look at certain jobs, you look at them, okay, this is a pure, work of science, or hey, there is this job which is a pure work of art.
Yeah.
But where do you place management consultancy? Is it art? Is it science? Or is it an absolute combination of both?
Yeah. This is something I get asked every now and then. I'd say it's definitely a combination of both. That might be the easy answer, but it is a combination of both,
Right.
realistically.
Yes.
I'd say the science part of it comes from the fact that aviation is a technical industry, right?
Hmm.
So when you have to credibly advise a client, you have to be able to bring in some of that deep industry knowledge, the technical skills, or at least an ability to see a situation of the client, break it down, get to a
Hmm.
certain level of detail that's needed to help that client, right?
Right.
So
Hmm.
that's where the science aspect of it comes in.
Hmm.
But as is the case with any management consulting, there's an art component of it because there's so many soft skills and so on involved in it, right? Because you need to be able to manage a team sometimes under very high pressure. You need to be able to communicate effectively, collaborate with the client, and so on, to be able to get the best possible outcomes for the client. And that is something which is very difficult to treat as a science. It is something that you can learn along the way as you grow in the career, but it is definitely, I'd say, an art in some sense. So the good thing is actually both of these, both the science part and the art part, are quite learnable or coachable over time. Right? It's just a matter of experience. It's a matter of exposure. It's a matter of having the right sort of mentorship and support when you are younger and learning the ropes in consulting as you go along.
True. And I think I'll pick your bones later on to what are the skill sets required, but from what you could say, it is definitely certain hard skills and certain soft skills, and combination of that is what makes a management consultant at the end of the day. Now, let me ask you certain strategic questions on consultancy, and it's a free for advice session, and I think this is definitely something which everyone will be looking to. Now, there is a classic, egg and chicken question within the industry. Is it network planning before fleet planning, or fleet planning before network planning?
Yeah.
Well, so what's your take? Yeah.
So here again, the perhaps convenient answer is that they go hand in hand. They kind of happen together because, well, they cannot happen independently, right? That's a recipe for disaster. And that's because the decisions on any one of them affects the others, right? Because let's say we do a lot of work with startups, startup airlines, right? And if you're starting with a clean sheet, typically what you would start with is getting a sense of, what is the market opportunity out there? Right? Given my strategy and so on as an airline, what is the market opportunity that I want to target? What does that mean in terms of which kind of routes I would ideally want to fly? What kind of volumes would I expect to target from those routes? Do I have partners who might cover some of those routes? Things of that sort. So to get a sense of what is the distribution, what is the network that you would want to cover, then you layer in the fleet choice, right? Here again, there's maybe a bigger strategic decision to make, which is, am I going to be a full service versus LCC versus hybrid kind of an airline? Am I going to have different diverse fleet, say turboprops and narrow bodies, or narrow bodies and wide bodies, right? And being able to layer that then onto the network to say which combination makes the most sense, right? Because you could, in theory, fly any network that you want to, but at the end of the day, you want to make money, right? Which is already pretty difficult in the industry. So you really need to be careful about having the most efficient kind of fleet and fleet deployment plan that you can put out. So there's a bit of iteration that then happens, right? To say, what if we choose these scenarios for our fleet composition? What does that mean for our network? What can we serve profitably? What is the net profitability that we can achieve as an airline? Typically we do that at one level to say, to decide, let's say we're going with narrow bodies. Then there's a decision of, is it going to be Airbus family or Boeing family typically, right? And then that's the next round of optimization that you do. And so you go through this series of iterations to be able to come up with what you hope would be a financially sustainable and productive network and fleet plan. So that's how I would say that the network planning and fleet planning components go hand in hand.
Absolutely right. And certainly it's on case-to-case basis as well, but more or less it has to go hand in hand because you cannot leave the other apart. Your fleet selection will definitely be based upon where you are flying, and certainly the vice versa way as well. So that's a very good way to look onto. And let me go on to the next question. Since we are talking about airlines and network and fleet planning. There was a era where the aircraft ranges were not sufficient enough to go from point A to point B nonstop, and that led to the formation of airline alliances. So Star Alliance, One World, SkyTeam, they all came into existence. But then, as the fuel efficiency and the range of the aircraft went forward, we found a lot of point-to-point airlines. Particularly if you look at Air New Zealand. Serving nonstop to North America and so on and so forth. Where do you see the role of airline partnerships going forward, particularly in this COVID era, where a lot of airlines are not able to access certain markets directly because of restrictions, but their partner airlines could definitely help them to reach out there. So what is your take on airline partnerships going forward? Yeah.
Well, I'd say that partnerships are really, I'd say, definitely a quite critical and important piece of this whole network planning puzzle, right? And the point that you made, right, about the COVID-related impacts on partnerships, I think that's a really good one, because my impression is in the last couple of years, as we've been struggling through this as an industry, airlines have kind of increasingly seen the value of partnerships, or come to realize once more the value of partnerships. Especially in times of uncertainty or financial distress, but also the fact that these are going to continue to be important even afterwards. It's not that there wasn't an acknowledgement of that before. That's why you had the alliances and so on. But you saw that a lot of the alliances were also being, let's say, complemented with bilateral joint ventures or independent code share agreements, partnerships, even with airlines who were in some other alliance in some cases. Right. So I think there was a bit of every airline looking out for itself. That will continue to happen in all likelihood, but fundamentally, I think the industry as a whole realizes there's no point in having this sort of internecine competition between airlines. Right. You are better off actually partnering within the appropriate framework in terms of competition regulations and so on. Right, to actually offer what is a more stable, a more consistent, a more financially sustainable service to the broader client base, to the broader customer and passenger base. Right? And what that means is that we've seen a lot of really interesting partnerships come up in the course of this pandemic, even between airlines that were maybe historically rivals, and you would have never assume that they would partner up. In the US, for example, you had JetBlue and American. In Brazil, you had, for a certain amount of time, you had Azul and LATAM, who are direct competitors in the domestic market, who were partnering. That's broken down since for certain other reasons. But that was a really interesting example as well. Recently, I think a couple of months ago in Africa, Kenya Airways and South African Airways announced that they are going to partner up to launch a new Pan-African airline. So you see a lot of these really interesting partnership conversations coming up now. You're also seeing a lot of, to the point that you made in the question, a lot of long-haul intercontinental airlines partnering with strong regional airlines, because they realize that they want to get a certain amount of market access, market penetration, but it's much more efficiently done through these local partners. So you have smaller airlines in Europe, in Africa, and elsewhere starting to look at Airlink, for example, out of South Africa. It's had a range of codeshare partnerships with many of the large intercontinental airlines serving South Africa. So you see those kind of relationships coming up as well. And I think in the larger scheme of things, it absolutely makes sense for the industry, because as a result of this, each individual airline is a little bit more secure financially. They can deploy their assets, their aircraft on routes which really make sense for them, where they have their strengths, instead of everyone trying to chase the same market and cutting each other out of it. So partnerships fundamentally, I think, are a great thing for the industry, and we're going to continue to see more of them post-COVID as well.
Definitely. I totally agree with you on this. In fact, this was way back in the year 2018 when I used to work at Heathrow. Emirates started a service out of Stansted, and that has EasyJet as their codeshare partner. So here you have got a low-cost airline partnering up with a full-service airline, but that gave Emirates a lot of access to unserved European markets.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on that point, right? Because now I think it's no longer a thing where you won't have different business models collaborating with each other. You mentioned EasyJet in London, right? They have this worldwide by EasyJet platform, which makes it easy for any partner to connect with them. In India as well, Indigo has a couple of codeshare partnerships now. So the important thing is who is strong in the market and can provide the necessary market access and penetration that the other airline needs, independent of whether it's a mix of business models or otherwise, because those issues can be sorted out over time.
Definitely. And quite an interesting answer out there, Arvind. There is a lot of food for thought on the table for our listeners as well to definitely analyze what you have just said, and obviously have their own sort of research on this as well. Now, moving on, Arvind, because we are discussing network and fleet, so let me throw in a fleet planning thing out here. We looked into what long-haul, low-cost airlines promised, especially during the golden years of our aviation industries, 2016, 2017. Continuous profitability. Norwegian was basically taking bread and butter out of the big four on the transatlantic market. We had Scoot, AirAsia X, getting a lot of limelight, but somehow that line has dipped. Okay. And with COVID, sort of coming or being much more aggressive, the load factors have certainly gone down. And the importance of, narrow body jets, which could go very long distances, for example, A321XLR, and what that brings onto the table. So connections like Delhi, London is something on paper which we could see definitely possible. So do you think that is the long haul low cost airline can enter back in this COVID era because of the lesser loads and less splurging money in people's pocket and everyone looking to sort of save some money out of their air travel? How do you see this, ultra long haul narrow body aircrafts and their importance with low cost with long haul low cost airlines?
Long haul low cost is I think it's really interesting as a market opportunity because there's in principle value in that business model, right? I'd say there's definitely demand for it at the right price because that's how Norwegian and others were able to fill their planes pre-COVID, right? But it is dependent on that certain price point or yield point in terms of being able to fill up the aircraft. The challenge for them, and you've had many of them like Norwegian, AirAsia X, WOW, Primera, and others. The challenge was just making the unit economics of that work, right? So it was often a cost game because the advantages that you might be able to get from being a short haul LCC, quick turnaround times and so on, you lose some of those advantages if you're playing the long haul market, right? You also have a greater need to deliver some of the basic passenger comforts in long haul that you can choose to completely monetize in short haul. So that's the economic challenge is what sunk a lot of these airlines in the past. I do think it will recover to an extent, simply because there is a market demand for it. And my belief is driven by a few things, right? One is, I think something like the 321 XLR could definitely add a lot of value, right? Because you are able to get something that's closer to the narrow body economics, but over a larger range, right? That makes it a little bit easier for an airline that is in the long haul, low cost space to be able to actually make money of these kind of routes. There have also been through the pandemic, because you've had so many aircraft grounded and so on, many operators have been able to get better leasing terms, right, from the aircraft, from the lessors, especially if you have a power by the hour agreement, which is essentially, in a simplistic way, it's, pay as you fly. That makes it a little easier also to bear some of the asset costs of being able to manage a long haul, low cost kind of network. So, and just over time, with, let's say with every new development in the industry, we are hitting incrementally better fuel efficiencies as well, which obviously help in terms of making the economic case for this. So I do think we will see that come back. And there are quite a few players who are trying that, right? Because forget the success of Norwegian, North Atlantic, I think, is the one. You had Play, which recently launched out of Iceland, I think about 6 months ago. You have another one called FlyPop that is planning to fly routes between UK and India. So there are other players who are doing this. You still have Scoot, which has been expanding now into Europe as well, out of Singapore. So I do think that we will continue to see more players, right? I don't think you will see some of the as many A330s, which are not going to be as efficient as the 787s, even though they are cheaper to acquire. So there will be a bit of a change in terms of the aircraft models. And certainly the 321 XLR, I think, will be possibly a big player coming in. We'll see airlines like, I think, Cebu Pacific and a couple of others have it on their order books. So I do think you will see more of it. One related thing though is my impression is that a pure play sort of single class service will probably not work on long haul low cost, or at least it'll be pretty difficult to make it work. So I expect most of these kind of operators will have some kind of premium cabin upfront, plus the premium economy, maybe even business, some premium ancillaries and so on. Because for most other normal long haul operators, those cabins are the ones that make the overall flight profitable, right? Not the cheap seats in the economy. So I do think that will be, from a strategic perspective, something that you will see some of these long haul low cost airlines coming up doing as well.
Definitely, Arvind. Quite an insightful perspective out there. It's the dynamics as to, at the end of the day, what does the balance sheet says? Okay, I mean, so far with less fuel price and with higher demand, low cost airlines or long haul low cost airlines were able to do it. But with changing dynamics, that's a challenge. But then yes, there is always a demand for such airlines out there. Jetstar, in fact, the Qantas subsidiary, has been doing pretty well on the Australian to Southeast Asia sector. So yes, there are such shining patches out there for sure. Being an Indian aviation talk, so we cannot keep the Indian markets, out without discussion. We always hear this, and particularly for the last 3-4 years, Indian domestic civil aviation industry, the fastest domestic civil aviation industry, almost a double-digit growth before the pandemic, and showed a very good sign of a recovery after the second wave. But despite of all of this numbers, we always find airlines struggling. There is always an example of a Kingfisher or a Jet Airways going bust. But there are other shining stars which are ready to sort of enter the market, like Akasa Air. Where do you see as a consultant? Are you bearish or are you bullish about the airline industry?
Well, about the Indian aviation industry, definitely bullish. I'd say simply because, it's the age-old story, right? India is a place of volumes. India is a scale game, and that's true not just for aviation, but any other industry as well. And that's why India is a hot market for the globe at large. So from the perspective of aviation, I think the volumes, the demand is certainly there, right? We've seen that whenever there are new routes launched, there is a pretty decent take-up. Of course, there's a pricing and yield management aspect to it, which I'll come to in a bit. But there is fundamentally a lot of untapped volume in our domestic market. Penetration is increasing, which is really good. I think in 2021, you had something like 40 to 50 new routes that were launched by different airlines. In part because your typical trunk routes and so on did not have as much traffic, and there was a need to redistribute assets. But also because there was genuine demand growth coming out of tier 2, tier 3 cities, right? And many of these new routes were not all feeding into a Delhi or a Bombay or a Bangalore, but connecting other parts of the country. So I think that penetration growing is certainly a good sign. I do think regional aviation could be a big unlock, right? You have a few airlines which are doing that, and so far they have survived, which I think is certainly a positive sign. Airports are being upgraded in order to be able to meet this potential for the industry. So on the whole, I'd say from a volume perspective and a demand perspective, it's certainly positive, right? The same is true for the international traffic as well, by the way, right? And I think that will continue to grow, especially driven by the LCCs. The challenge that I see, and you pointed that out, right, which is they don't make money. Historically, there's always been from the industry perspective, I'd say a bit of a lack of fare discipline or capacity discipline, right? If everybody is fighting around a plus or minus 100 rupee price point, and you can't build a certain differentiation in terms of pricing or otherwise, you are going to struggle, right? It's going to become a race to the bottom. There's also historically been capacity discipline in that lack of capacity discipline, that there's been a lot of dumping on certain routes. I do think that is now dispersing a lot more with a much broader network coming in. But I think that will also take some time to change. but things are again moving in a positive direction on that front, right?
Definitely.
From a regulatory perspective as well, maybe there will be some changes which help to bring down the cost base for Indian carriers. There are moves being done to be able to make MRO fundamentally cheaper to access, and then for Indian airlines who currently do most of their MRO activities offshore, which is a shame.
Offshore,
right? That there's a strong industry push to be able to bring down fuel costs in terms of taxation and so on, and some states have already taken that call, right? So I do think the tailwinds are very positive in that sense, where the volumes continue to be make a strong case for why one should be bullish about the market. And on the cost side of things as well, things are changing, where one can hope that the airlines over the next decade will be far more financially stable than the airlines over the last decade.
Right. So anyone listening to Arvind, it's the airline stocks which they need to invest in.
No comment.
No comments on that. Right. I think Arvind totally agree with you on this point. Yes, the Udan. Yeah.
Sorry, just I want to mention one more thing that's important to keep in mind though, right? Because we're talking about the potential for a lot of growth, right? A key element of that to sort of make that work is skills and skilling, right? And I think that might be particularly relevant given your platform,
right?
Because you need to have enough people to be able to fill up that growth potential for the industry. And it's not just when you talk about skilling, people typically think about cockpit or cabin crew, but there's a whole ecosystem around it, right? You have engineering and technicians, you have dispatchers, and so many other roles within the industry. There's a need to ensure there's sufficient skilling as well to be able to meet that potential. So just wanted to add that point as well.
Definitely, Arvind. I totally agree with you. And that's sometimes we need to see the industry from a different perspective. Everyone is walking on the same track. When you think about, or when you ask an outsider about the industry, what they think is, okay, this industry is all about pilots and cabin crews. And that's it. But there is a plethora of workforce which is working behind the scenes. And that is what makes the industry 24/7. So totally agree with you. And that requires a lot of skill sets. Certainly, Arvind. And talking about skill sets, there is one skill as a management consultant. From my perspective, I feel that which is very important, something which I want all the learners and all the listeners to also develop over a period of time is problem solving and troubleshooting skills. Because every time sort of organization approaches your consultancy firm, I'm sure that they come with certain problem statements or certain areas of assistance, basically. So at X, they want to go to X plus Y and so on and so forth. So how, as a management consultant, you see troubleshooting skills or problem solving skills as a major part of your role, basically? Yeah.
Well, I'd say it's one of the core skills in some sense that you would expect of a consultant or consulting firm. I wouldn't necessarily position it as saying it's problem solving. But it is problem solving, or I wouldn't position it as troubleshooting necessarily, because that makes it sound always a little negative, right? In that there's something that's going wrong that needs to be fixed. That could be the case, and often is in many aviation companies. But it's also more broadly about being able to figure out what are the immediate priorities for a particular client, right? What are the biggest pain points that you can work with them to solve? Right. So it's the same thing that you mentioned, but I would put a slightly different spin on it. This is also one of those skills that you learn, you pick up over time. Many of the core consulting skills are eminently coachable, right? In that, with experience, by seeing how others are doing it, you will learn them over time, right? In this particular case, right, if you have a certain issue that your client is facing, what you would normally be expected to do coming in as a consultant is to say, okay, what is the core issue that we're trying to solve here, right? Or what is the main concern that the client has, or the main priority we should address? How can I break that down a little bit, make it into addressable chunks, right, that I can then later put back together to have an answer for the client? For each of those chunks, do I, as a consultant, as a technical expert or otherwise, do I have a hypothesis about what direction it should go in, and how can I test that hypothesis? What kind of analysis should I do? What kind of research is required? Who should be involved from the client or from other experts in order to be able to crack this particular problem, right? so you kind of sort of work through it in levels that way,
Right.
to say, so here's my analysis. Here's what we do that makes us believe that this particular hypothesis is true or this particular solution would work for them, and then build that back up to say, so here was the concern that was identified, and here's what we see as the potential solutions. It's important in doing this, and something which I can never stress enough is you have to avoid coming in as a completely sort of fully hands-off party, right? It works in some specific situations, but in most other cases, if you want to actually make lasting change at a client, you have to work along with them, which means taking their functional teams and so on along on that journey, right? Helping them buy in early on into the process as to what you're doing, why you're doing it, so that when you finally take it back to maybe the decision makers in the client, you have the backing of the people who would actually have to execute on some of those things, right? So not only have you broken down the problem and been able to come back with a solution, you've also ensured that the people who would have to work with that solution are on board with it. And therefore, your ultimate objective, which should be to improve the situation for that client, is not just something that's on paper, but something that can actually be achieved once it's implemented.
Absolutely right, and I totally agree with you, Arvind. I when I speak with industry people, whenever teams they hear about consultant, they feel that something is wrong within the organization and something is wrong with them, which is to be fixed. Hence, someone external is hired, and then they go two steps back and not see consultant as someone whom they could work with and sort of grow the problem or sorry the solution together. But then it goes the other way around. So totally echo my voices with you on that. It has to be a blend of both the client and the consultant working together. And obviously, there are multiple layers of skill sets which are required, and not only problem solving per se. Whenever I interact with a lot of aviation students, particularly, they see aviation consultant as something which they could never achieve, because they always feel that, okay, we need someone, or we need to be from an Ivy League school, or need to be from an IIM grade B school to be out there as a management consultant. And along with that, we need tons and tons of years of experience to be, a management consultant. So Arvind, this is the golden opportunity for you to address such, students, and what's the way through which they could sort of be a consultant one day?
Yeah. Well, I can understand why there's that impression that you need to be from certain universities or so on to get into management consulting. I would say, just to address that point of yours, that's definitely not the case. To be honest, the value of some of these institutes is, I'd say, twofold. One is that they give you early access, right? So as a graduate of these early in your career, you might be able to get better access to some of these quote unquote attractive companies and opportunities. But a few years into your career, it doesn't really matter where you study, right? What matters is what you've done, what you've achieved, and what potential you show for the future. Right. The second advantage of these kind of institutes is that you build a good network, right, of contemporaries, many of whom may go on to do great things, but that would not necessarily be the only network that you build over time, right? So there is some inherent value maybe early in the career to having those kind of brands behind you, but those fade out quickly over time, and then it's just down to you as an individual. There's also the fact that, quite frankly, let's call it the knowledge economy, right, is much more democratic now, especially through what's happened through COVID, because you have so many more platforms for people to learn, but also to demonstrate their credentials, to show that they can be experts or they have a point of view on something much beyond the brand of the institute where they study, right? So you can actually create your own opportunities in a much better way now, with much greater exposure possibility than you could have a decade ago. So I would definitely say don't get too hung up on the issue of what educational path you took. There are still opportunities. There are several ways in which you can sort of build your path into into management consulting. You want to talk about management consulting in general or specifically aviation consulting?
Aviation management consulting, because that is what majority of the audience could look into, but we could look at general skills and then narrow it down to certain aviation skills as well.
Well, let's talk about aviation consulting, right? Because it is a specific field. You might be a fantastic management consultant in general, but you may not have sufficient credibility with an aviation client if you don't know the industry, right? If you can't talk in their language. So I would say definitely a certain amount of industry knowledge is necessary. It could fundamentally exposure to the industry, right? Ideally through directly working in the industry, because that's when you'll be most credible, but that's not a must, right? I haven't worked directly at an airline myself, for example, but at least through exposure, through past projects, through education, through research. And a lot of that is self-driven in terms of your love for the industry, because we're all our geeks here, right? As well as a willingness to learn and engage with the industry. So there's the industry knowledge side of things. And then there's the consulting skills, right? We spoke earlier about problem structuring and solving. And again, it's something that we can learn over time. An essential part of that would be like creative thinking, innovation, being able to think a little out of the box to be able to get to crack problems for your clients. Analytical skills are important. We are an industry that has a lot of data at its disposal, which is often not necessarily used as efficiently as it could be, right? We spoke earlier about network and fleet planning. That's all data, right? I mean, there's a bit of gut feel to it, but also a lot of data to be able to make the case for what kind of network you're going to fly as an airline. There's interpersonal and communication skills, which we touched upon earlier in our conversation as well. How to manage people internally and externally to ensure you're working productively, how to communicate most effectively to a client or to other stakeholders so that you can really be a sort of a trusted advisor who can hold their hand and take them through to actually making the change that you want to see. And apart from this, I'd say there's also a sort of a need for the right mindset, because you need to be a little flexible, right? You are going to be hopping project to project. You're looking at many different parts of the world, many different business models and so on. So a little bit of comfort with that chop and change of flexibility. And I'd say being able to handle the pressure that comes with working in a project environment, right? Because you're not in a line function where you have a stable, steady view of your role over the next, say, seasons or years. You have some pressure to deliver in a short time frame and create value for the client. So being able to handle that pressure is part of what a consultant would need as well. I hope that answers the question.
Oh yes, definitely. And there are certain skills which you talked about, which the students will learn over a period of time as they work with different clients and consultants. That's where the knowledge will come. But they also need to enter the industry with some basic knowledge, with some sort of idea about what the industry is all about. And definitely there has to be a passion from within to know more about what the industry is and what is happening, knowing about the current affairs and so on and so forth. Now, Arvind, you mentioned that you definitely were not from aviation background, but here you are as an aviation management consultant. So is there a career roadmap to become an aviation management consultant? Can we time it, or sort of can we have fixed blocks which, okay, if I do these 3 things, it will make me a management consultant? Or is it as we go kind of thing? Yeah,
I would suggest not trying to time block it necessarily, right? Link it more to skills or capabilities and what kind of opportunistic steps you take, as opposed to necessarily trying to put a time block to it.
Right.
And by the way, as you just mentioned again, I haven't worked at an airline, right? Maybe it's helpful to just share my story a bit. Yeah. For me, I grew up in a household which was talking aviation a lot, because my father used to work at the Emirates Group. Wow. And many of our friends and colleagues were also in the aviation industry. So I've always had an interest in the industry from the time I was very young, but I didn't study specifically, aviation studies or anything of that sort. I did my engineering. I did my MBA, joined a management consulting firm, which was a generalist firm, not an aviation firm. But I've always sort of very actively followed the industry and been wanting to engage with the industry. So I did have the opportunity to work for in the aviation space when I was at that firm. But when I was looking to make a move from there, I was very clear I wanted to step into the industry itself. And that's when I came across the opportunity at Lufthansa Consulting. And for me, it was a great mix because I really do enjoy consulting. So I was able to bring that, but be able to do it in the field that I love, which is aviation. So it came together very nicely for me in that way. And it's a decision that I haven't regretted since. That could be the path for some people, right? When you talk about the roadmap, where you start off by being in a more generalist consulting world, right? Perhaps most consulting firms have a practice area on travel, tourism, logistics, within which you would find airlines as a business unit. So being a little bit more involved in that, trying to get experience of those projects to judge if that is really the path that you want to go down in terms of being a specialist in that field. And if it is, then that could be one career path, right? Where within the generalist firm, you become an expert on airlines or travel, or at some point you choose to move to a boutique firm to be able to pursue your specific passion for aviation, right? That's one option. The other is where you come in from the industry, right? So you spend a few years in the industry, you have a certain amount of technical knowledge in your field. That is really important, like I mentioned earlier, because that makes you credible when you're facing a client, right? You can talk their language, you know what kind of systems they use, you know what kind of KPIs they're looking at, and so on. So there is a lot of value for consulting firms being able to bring on board folks who are actually experts in their domain, or at least have some amount of exposure, even if it's just for a few years. So that could be another path that you can take. And many of the folks that I'm hiring now into Lufthansa Consulting are taking that path. The third path is early on in your career, if you're studying actually aviation management or doing some other bachelor's or master's degree, which is specifically in aviation or travel, you could also seek to directly move into aviation consulting from there, right? You may not have the full set of consulting skills. You may not have deep knowledge necessarily about a specific functional area in aviation, but that's perfectly okay, right? That's what you will get exposure to, you will learn over time, and you will grow. So I'd say coming from a more generalist field into aviation consulting, coming from the industry into aviation consulting, and then coming as a result of your educational background into aviation consulting could be the kind of roadmaps one could consider.
Very well summed up, Arvind, and definitely your story is something, I'll like to quote it as when passion meets profession equals success, which has definitely fallen for you. I mean, still the success is, obviously it's coming as we speak.
Yeah.
My final question, and it's not a silver bullet, but definitely, what is your golden advice for the aspiring aviation consultant? What is that one advice would you like to give to this young, passionate aviation individuals?
If I had to choose one thing, I would say, irrespective of where you are, what you're doing now, if you have a desire to work more closely in the aviation industry, including in consulting, engage as much as possible with the industry as of now. So engagement would be my one big thing, and engage regularly and meaningfully. What I mean by that is, I think there's for those who want to come into aviation, right? We're often really passionate about the industry. We're intellectually curious. We want to learn more, right, about what's happening. We follow all the things that are going on in the industry. So that's what I would suggest anybody who wants to step into this industry do as well. Be intellectually curious, ask questions, read quite widely, follow developments that are happening in the industry, whether it's in the news or see what senior figures are posting on their blogs or on LinkedIn and so on. Follow those people, talk to people, right? Don't be passive in terms of just taking this information in. Talk to people, engage on discussion boards, ask questions, because aviation is by and large a reasonably friendly world. Right? We have geeks kind of appreciate that among each
Yes,
other. There's a sense of
definitely.
community among us, right? So in most cases, people are not going to rebuff you if you ask questions and want to learn more about the industry. So be fearless in terms of taking those steps and engaging proactively whether you have that opportunity. And along with that, over time, can try to develop your own perspective, right? Run some analysis, do some market research, have a point of view on a particular news article, test
Hmm.
that point of view, share it, right?
Right.
Because the more that you can demonstrate that you have a perspective or that you're thinking about things, right? Instead of just passively taking them in, the more you are
Yes.
building your personal brand as well within the aviation space,
Hmm.
right? You will have better conversations. You'll have people reaching out, wanting to talk to you. You will be opening up your network and your opportunities. And that could help you eventually get into the industry, depending on which kind of role you want. So to sum it all up, for me, the magic word is engagement, right? Which is engage with the industry, be a part of
Definitely.
it, immerse
Hmm.
yourself in it, and you will find those opportunities opening up.
Perfect. Well summed up, Arvind. In fact, engagement, and obviously to that is curiosity, to reach people, to talk to them, to share opinions, build your own personal brand. And I think platform like LinkedIn definitely, help these upcoming aviation students to sort of enter that sort of corporate world or that industry life, sort of
Yeah.
meet experts like you, and definitely sort of take it from there. Right, Arvind, excellent session, and cannot thank you more for it. There is one final piece of thing which I would like to sort of do with you, and this is something which we do with all our guests in our
Okay.
talk show. So rapid fire with Arvind. Okay.
Ooh, okay.
So definitely, short, simple, crisp answers. Um,
Mhm.
so my first question to you, Arvind, is a life in Germany or a life in India? Which is the one which you would prefer?
This I unfortunately have to go 50-50 on because family is India. India is just home. India is comfort,
Right.
right? But Germany has its advantages. The elements, frankly, of quality of life and so on, which are better here.
True.
So it's really 50-50, and I'm really happy that I really have a foot in both worlds. It
Right.
helps being an airline in an airline group because it's easier to fly back home as well.
Definitely. Like an absolute consultant, you have answered it really well. Not neglected any of the equations out there. Right. Perfect. Your favorite aviation media house, something which you would always refer to as your go-to information.
Ooh, I don't want to seem like I'm pitching for any particular source, but I really like what CH Aviation
Hmm.
does.
Hmm.
Right, I think they are a group of very passionate folks who have built a business from the ground up, and it's really driven by their desire to learn more about the industry and share that knowledge with everybody else. So I quite like CH Aviation as a source for information. I also have other sources such as say Cirium, Kappa, and others who are also really good. And I think it's helpful to have a range of sources because then you ensure you're not missing out anything of what's happening in the industry.
Perfect. Perfect. My next question to you is, what is that one word which best describes your personality?
Ooh, it's that's probably something you should ask the people that I work with. But if it's difficult to go with the word, I'm going to go with the phrase. It's a cliche, but it's work hard and play hard.
Perfect.
That life can get intense as a consultant, right?
Right.
And I really, really enjoy the work I do. So I do not mind working hard and really getting into things with my clients. But on the other hand, I also like having fun, whether it is especially within the team, right? So we're very, I'd say we have a lot of humor, we have a lot of laughter within our teams as well. So I think that's the balance that I like in my life and hopefully bring to my work as well.
Perfect. Work hard and play hard it is. Perfect. Arvind, this is your golden ticket, which Udan Aviation Academy would like to provide you. Space tourism, if given an opportunity, which of these would you fly? Virgin Galactic or Blue Origin?
It depends. Are Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos going to be on the flight with me?
Oh, there you go. We'll like to have them.
Well, I don't know. I think probably Virgin, simply because I like the brand. For no other reason. I don't think the experience would be dramatically different in either one of them.
Perfect. So it's an navigating insight. See, that comes always. It comes naturally, right? My next question to you is: what's your top advice to your 20-year-old self?
Invest in Apple stock.
Perfect, Arvind. Perfect. I mean, there is a craze of diversified investments in India, which is going on. Definitely beyond FDs is what the modern generation is looking into, and here you have definitely Apple stocks for that. My final question to you is: if Arvind was not into aviation, then what? Then what Arvind would have been?
From a career perspective?
From a life perspective, I'll say, because I think you have figured out the career answer already.
Well, I don't know. I think I'd like to, if I wasn't in aviation, I think I'd like to be doing something in, maybe I'd like to be like a scuba dive instructor on some nice island somewhere. I think that would be like a dream alternative life for me.
Perfect, Arvind. There you go, scuba diver. It is definitely, I'll take the scuba sessions with you then. You definitely have one client with you already in your new domain for sure. Perfect, Arvind. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for making this podcast reach new heights. And thank you for your time. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Ashish. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.